Chapter 13 of Pollyanna Grows Up. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mary Anderson. Pollyanna Grows Up by Eleanor H. Porter. Chapter 13, A Waiting and a Winning. It was a delightful plan. Pollyanna had it entirely formulated in about 5 minutes. Then she told Mrs. Carew. Mrs. Carew did not think it was a delightful plan, and she said so very distinctly. "Oh, but I'm sure they'll think it is," argued Pollyanna, in reply to Mrs. Carew's objections. "And just think how easy we can do it. The tree is just as it was except for the presents. And we can get more of those. It won't be so very long till just New Year's Eve, and only think how glad she'll be to come. Wouldn't you be if you hadn't had anything for Christmas, only blistered feet and chicken pie?" "Dear, dear, what an impossible child you are," frowned Mrs. Carew. "Even yet it doesn't seem to occur to you that we don't know this young person's name." "So we don't. And isn't it funny when I feel that I know her so well?" smiled Pollyanna. "You see, we had such a good talk in the garden that day, and she told me all about how lonesome she was, and that she thought the lonesomest place in the world was in a crowd in a big city, because folks didn't think nor notice. Oh, there was one that noticed, but he noticed too much, she said, and he hadn't ought to notice her any. Which is kind of funny, isn't it, when you come to think of it? But anyhow, he came for her there in the garden to go somewhere with him, and she wouldn't go. And he was a real handsome gentleman, too, until he began to look so cross, just at the last. Folks aren't so pretty when they're cross, are they? Now, there was a lady today looking at bows, and she said, well, lots of things that weren't nice, you know. And she didn't look pretty either, after she began to talk. But you will let me have the tree New Year's Eve, won't you, Mrs. Carew, and invite this girl who sells bows, and Jamie? He's better, you know, now, and he could come. Of course Jerry would have to wheel him, but then we'd want Jerry anyway." "Oh, of course, Jerry!" exclaimed Mrs. Carew in ironic scorn. "But why stop with Jerry? I'm sure Jerry has hosts of friends who would love to come, and—" "Oh, Mrs. Carew, may I?" broke in Pollyanna in uncontrollable delight. "Oh, how good, good, good you are! I've so wanted—" But Mrs. Carew fairly gasped aloud in surprise and dismay. "No, no, Pollyanna, she began protestingly. But Pollyanna, entirely mistaking the meaning of her interruption, plunged in again in stout championship. "Indeed you are good, just the bestest ever, and I shan't let you say you aren't. Now, I reckon I'll have a party all right. There's a Tommy Dolan and his sister Jenny, and the 2 McDonald children, and 3 girls whose names I don't know that live under the Murphys, and a whole lot more, if we have room for 'em. And only think how glad they'll be when I tell 'em. Why, Mrs. Carew, seems to me as if I never knew anything so perfectly lovely in all my life. And it's all your doings. Now, mayn't I begin right away to invite 'em, so they'll know what's comin' to 'em?" And Mrs. Carew, who would not have believed such a thing possible, heard herself murmuring a faint "yes," which she knew bound her to the giving of a Christmas tree party on New Year's Eve to a dozen children from Murphy's Alley and a young salesgirl whose name she did not know. Perhaps in Mrs. Carew's memory was still lingering a young girl's "Sometimes I wonder there don't some of 'em think of helpin' the girls before they go wrong." Perhaps in her ears was still ringing Pollyanna's story of that same girl who had found a crowd in a big city the loneliest place in the world, yet who had refused to go with the handsome man that had noticed too much. Perhaps in Mrs. Carew's heart was the undefined hope that somewhere in it all lay the peace she had so longed for. Perhaps it was a little of all three combined, with utter helplessness in the face of Pollyanna's amazing twisting of her irritated sarcasm into the wide-sweeping hospitality of a willing hostess. Whatever it was, the thing was done, and at once Mrs. Carew found herself caught into a veritable whirl of plans and plottings, the center of which was always Pollyanna and the party. To her sister, Mrs. Carew wrote distractedly of the whole affair, closing with, "What I'm going to do I don't know, but I suppose I shall have to keep right on doing as I'm doing. There is no other way. Of course, if Pollyanna once begins to preach, but she hasn't yet, so I can't, with a clear conscience, send her back to you." Della, reading this letter at the sanatorium, laughed aloud at the conclusion. "Hasn't preached yet, indeed!" she chuckled to herself. "Bless her dear heart! And yet you, Ruth Carew, own up to giving 2 Christmas tree parties within a week, and as I happen to know, your home, which used to be shrouded in death-like gloom, is aflame with scarlet and green from top to toe. But she hasn't preached yet. Oh, no, she hasn't preached yet." The party was a great success. Even Mrs. Carew admitted that. Jamie in his wheelchair, Jerry with his startling but expressive vocabulary, and the girl, whose name proved to be Sadie Dean, vied with each other in amusing the more diffident guests. Sadie Dean, much to the others' surprise, and perhaps to her own, disclosed an intimate knowledge of the most fascinating games. And these games, with Jamie's stories and Jerry's good-natured banter, kept every one in gales of laughter until supper, and the generous distribution of presents from the laden tree sent the happy guests home with tired sighs of content. If Jamie, who with Jerry was the last to leave, looked about him a bit wistfully, no one apparently noticed it. Yet Mrs. Carew, when she bade him good night, said low in his ear, half impatiently, half embarrassedly, "Well, Jamie, have you changed your mind about coming?" The boy hesitated. A faint color stole into his cheeks. He turned and looked into her eyes wistfully, searchingly. Then very slowly he shook his head. "If it could always be like tonight, I could," he sighed. "But it wouldn't. There'd be tomorrow and the next week, and next month, and next year comin', and I'd know before next week that I hadn't oughter come." If Mrs. Carew had thought that the New Year's Eve party was to end the matter of Pollyanna's efforts in behalf of Sadie Dean, she was soon undeceived. For the very next morning Pollyanna began to talk of her. "And I'm so glad I found her again," she prattled contentedly. "Even if I haven't been able to find the real Jamie for you, I found somebody else for you to love. And of course you'll love to love her, 'cause it's just another way of loving Jamie." Mrs. Carew drew in her breath and gave a little gasp of exasperation. This unfailing faith in her goodness of heart and unhesitating belief in her desire to help everybody was most disconcerting, and sometimes most annoying. At the same time, it was a most difficult thing to disclaim, under the circumstances, especially with Pollyanna's happy, confident eyes full on her face. "But, Pollyanna," she objected impotently at last, feeling very much as if she were struggling against invisible silken cords, this girl really isn't Jamie at all, you know." "I know she isn't," sympathized Pollyanna quickly. "And of course I'm just as sorry she isn't Jamie as can be. But she's somebody's Jamie. That is, I mean, she hasn't got anybody down here to love her and notice, you know.